Hi Life Groups, I hope you are doing well. On Sunday I preached about singleness from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verses 17 to 35. So if you want to pause the video, make sure you've read that passage and then press play again when you are ready. Okay, so the main message we can get from 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that singleness is a gift. It is good to be single. And Paul is arguing that singleness has advantages over marriage for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. So my first question then is, why does singleness have advantages? And why would a church that doesn't have single people in it be lacking? So again, pause the video, discuss that question, and then come back when you are ready. Okay, secondly, you might have noticed that on Sunday, I didn't finish 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And the reason for that mainly is time. But also, the last few verses of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 are a little bit controversial. They are debated. People can't agree the best way to translate these verses. And so it's very difficult for us in Leeds in 2025 to understand how we can apply these verses to our own life. So we're going to read the passage now, and we're going to see why. So if you want to pause the video and read together verses 36 to 40. 36 to 40. Okay, great. So if you've got an NIV translation of 1 Corinthians, you'll notice that there is a footnote at the bottom of chapter 7. And in that footnote, there is an alternative interpretation of these verses. And after reading the commentaries, I think this alternative interpretation is the better interpretation. It's the one that's closer to the original Greek and the original meaning. So I'm going to read that alternative interpretation now, and it says this. If anyone thinks he is not treating his daughter properly, and if she is getting along in years, and he feels she ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He is not sinning. He should let her get married. The man who has settled this matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his own mind to keep the virgin unmarried, this man also does the right thing. So then he who gives her his virgin in marriage does right, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Very small writing, I should have printed it out larger, sorry about that. So this second alternative interpretation of these verses suggests that it is about a father who is arranging for his daughter to get married. And if these verses are closer to the original meaning, then that's very difficult for us in our culture to apply that to our lives. Because the normal in Britain, 2025, is not for fathers to arrange marriages for their daughters. I think also, if you are from a culture where arranged marriage is normal, and I know some of you are, it's also difficult to apply to your own life because these verses might still be referring to the situation that is happening in Corinth at the time. So earlier in the passage, Paul says the reason why it is good and better to remain single is because of the present crisis. And most commentators agree that the Greek wording here for present crisis means a specific event that's happening in Corinth at the time of writing. It's not talking about the present crisis, which is waiting for Jesus to return. It's talking about something happening in Corinth at the time. And so we can say that these verses probably apply to Corinth, to the virgins in Corinth at the time. And it's probably talking to fathers arranging marriage. The other reason why I think that Paul isn't saying here singleness is better in general, in all time, in all situations, is because Paul doesn't say that. So in the second part of that passage, in verses 39 and 40, Paul is talking about widows. And Paul says about the widows that if they remain unmarried, they will be happier. And I think there's lots of truth in that we can say you will be happy if you remain unmarried as a widow. And you can sort of see why Paul might recommend that. But actually, Paul doesn't recommend this for all widows, in all places, in all time. Because in 1 Timothy, Paul is writing to Timothy, who is in Ephesus. And so he's writing about the widows in Ephesus, so a different place. Corinthians is written to the church in Corinth, and then 1 Timothy is applied to the church in Ephesus. And he says about those widows, he says it's good for them to get married, better, in fact, for them to get married. He says, stop being idle busybodies, get married and have children. And so we can see how whether marriage or singleness is better depends on the circumstance, depends on the individual, depends on the context. So what can we take from these passages? Is singleness or marriage better? Well, the answer is they're both gifts. They're both good. And we shouldn't over worry about which of them, which gift we have, because they're both good gifts. And we need to honor both gifts. I think Paul is really bothered about whether we are in a situation, the best situation for us to serve God. He really cares that we have undivided devotion to Jesus. And so he says, whatever situation you're in, have undivided devotion to Jesus. So he's saying here that if by getting married you can serve God better, get married. If by remaining single you can serve God better, stay single. You don't need to get married. It is good to stay single and serve the Lord that way. If you are not in the position to choose the situation, don't worry about it too much. Serve God in the situation that you are in. But knowing that singleness is good, and knowing that, I think we need to do a little bit of work in the church to make sure singleness is valued, to make sure singleness is plausible for the people in our church. Then there might be practical things that we can do to make this easier. And I think one of the main things we need to remember is our culture idolizes sex and romance. And we need to be different in the church. We need to be other than our culture. And so we shouldn't also idolize sex and romance by idolizing marriage. But what we need to do is honour friendship. Honour friendship. Friendship is so important in the church. And as married people, married couples and families, you need to think about how best can you love and serve your single friends. And those of us who are single, we need to think about how best we can love and serve our married friends. We are all brothers and sisters together. Singleness does not equal loneliness. We are family. And so the final question then is, how can you serve and love each other as friends? Once you've answered that question, it would be great to pray for single people in Gateway Church. And there's lots of things you could pray for. I think the number one thing you can do is ask single people what they want prayer for. Please don't assume that they want you to pray that they would find a spouse. It is good to pray that single people would find spouses if that's what they want. So please ask first, but absolutely, please pray for that. But there might be other things that they're finding difficult or challenging that they specifically want prayer for. So please ask specifically, what do you want prayer for? And I think over and above everything else, the best thing we can pray for our single people in Gateway is that they would have undivided devotion to the Lord. Hope that video is helpful. Thanks for watching.